My name is Joseph Kopser and I'm joined by Brett Boyd. Our latest Greyline video gets into manufacturing. You see, for the first, say, 10,000 years of civilization, people and organizations made everything on spot. But as we got bigger, we started to realize that we needed to consolidate manufacturing, and that had an impact on the economy. But now through technology, we're able to use additive manufacturing or 3D printing or other new industrial automation techniques to really spread out how we do it and the actual process at each location. And it's going to have amazing worldwide impact on how it's going to impact the economy, public sector, and what it's going to look like in the future. So Brett, from the big picture, what is happening globally?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, look, there is a lot happening in manufacturing, and this is admittedly not a topic that most people find, sexy and compelling. This is not cocktail party talk, except for us. But really, it's important to understand the role of manufacturing in the global system, right? So global trade and globalization and this whole movement of the last, 20 years, call it the early to mid 90s through today, has been an interconnected supply chain system. Right? I mean, so how the world works is basically if you're going to buy a laptop, there are materials that were mined in some countries and then they were shipped to a different country where they were built into a kind of a low value added component, shipped to another company, assembled into something higher, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not outside the realm of the possible that that laptop has parts from 40 plus countries and has been on 6 to 8 large ships as it moved around. So it's important to understand that this whole idea that manufacturing should be done in the lowest cost labor markets possible that's the foundation of how the world kind of works today. And so the important thing to think about when you look at industrial automation and you look at additive manufacturing is that it decorrelates that whole low-cost labor and manufacturing here. Because again, if you're looking at an environment, I mean, 3D printing is something that's actually been around a long time. This dates back to stereolithography and some of these initial SLA models that organizations use for rapid prototyping back in the 90s, I believe even back into the 80s. But these technologies have evolved to where you can now print with plastics, you can print with metal, you can print multidimensional shapes, you can print large structures. And so the applications are growing. And this is no longer just a creative and a design tool, it's becoming a manufacturing tool. And we're not there yet, we're up the curve. But when we hit the point where more and more subcomponent parts are printed, we're going to remove the incentive to print them in low-cost markets because, again, the printer cost is going to be roughly fixed. The primary cost of the object being manufactured is going to come from where it's printed. So why would you not print it nearer to where you're going to sell it as opposed to on the other side of the world where labor is cheap if labor is not the primary driver? So you reorganize the whole system here, which, as you mentioned, flows through everybody. And some of the implications of this are really, really far-reaching and interesting to think about.
So in everything we do at Greyline, we try to make sure you understand how it's going to impact the private sector and the public sector. So very briefly, just what's going to happen to governments, whether they are developed or developing countries, as this revolution takes over?
Well, so, I mean, look, a lot of different things. And it kind of depends on the different types of companies or the different types of economies. But really, these economies that are oriented on outsourced manufacturing need to be very thoughtful about this. 3D printing will provide some new tools for local manufacturing, for different types of entrepreneurial activity, and the ability for, as you mentioned, the rise of the craftsman, kind of back to that idea that people can have a vision and create it in real time without these big supply chains. So there are a lot of opportunities, but there's a ton of risk for these organizations that are entirely oriented on outsourced manufacturing. And as that goes away, it'll be interesting to see how it develops. I mean, the traditional path for economic development for a country, to include the United States, is to start as a low value added manufacturer and work up the value chain. Oh, absolutely. This is our heritage. And it's unclear what the global system looks like if that first rung on the ladder goes away. And so this is again something that we're looking at some of the different movements. We don't presume to have total foreknowledge on how all this plays out, but I think that this is an area where we all need to be very thoughtful. I think the developed world is a large benefactor of this. I think we'll see an onshoring of manufacturing jobs. They're going to be different than the manufacturing jobs that left in this last wave of globalization, but I think you're going to see some of those jobs come back, and I think you're going to see a lot more regionalized economic activity. But similarly, the developed world, as we are in a connected planet here, it's important to think about how to support some of these other nations and how to facilitate responsible planning, because the security dynamics and all of these other issues that play into, what does it mean when the traditional path towards development changes?
Yeah, and in the private sector, we can't even really imagine right now, especially for those companies that are involved in supply chain management. In the United States, the single most common occupation is truck driver. And that's because we're delivering goods all across the country, many of which are imported, and we're delivering it to the final destination and then often picked up and taken to another part in the supply chain management. But what happens when more industrial automation and more additive manufacturing occur at the point of usage? That's going to decrease the amount of need for delivery and that long supply chain.
Oh, sure.
Companies need to be thinking about what that looks like now. So before we tune out, what else do people need to know about manufacturing?
I mean, look, again, this is something that affects far beyond just the manufacturing sector. So these shifts hit the industry broadly. You mentioned supply chain, tie into that warehousing, tie into that a lot of different industries. And really what we're trying to do is we're actually trying to build some data sets to look at the timing. Because again, this is an issue where I think it's easy to say, okay, that sounds important, but when is it important? When do I need to act? With the idea that being on the front edge of these trends is where you want to be, but being way ahead of these, it can be as risky as being behind in some cases. So we really are trying to build up some data sets to help look at the inflection point for when this tips. Because I don't think we're there yet. I still think we're in the first wave of adoption, and I think it gets very interesting here in the next few years. And that's really what we've been focused on helping our customers understand up to this point is, again, what's happening and when do I need to do something, if I need to do something, and what is my decision calculus look like? So that's been the predominance of our research efforts up to this point.
Right. And finally, I'll end on an optimistic note, which is just imagine what has happened to our planet 30, 40 years after the introduction of personal computers on the desk of so many young people around the world, and that creative spirit of what they were able to build with their minds and build with their hands with a personal computer. Now just project that into the future with 3D printing. Mm-hmm. What is it going to mean unleashing a whole new class of engineers, inventors, and crafts people who are able to take their ideas and put it into use? So that's what we're trying to do at Grayline, is help you understand the future of manufacturing, like Brett said, to be able to see what's going on, decide what you're going to do about it, and then how you execute that strategy. So please join us on the Grayline website. We have a lot more videos of other catalysts that are impacting society, and we hope you can tune in and send us your feedback. Thank you very much for joining us.